Davy Jones is often regarded as the best looking CGI character of all time. But why? Because whilst he was the first ever character to use that on-set motion capture technology, which meant that his actor, Bill Nighy, could be present on the film set and actually able to interact with the cast around him, him being the first means that every other CG character that followed him also had access to the same technology. In fact, they presumably had access to better versions of it. So why did we get such diminishing returns in quality, when surely they should have just gotten better and better and better? Well, this is exactly the question we're going to answer in this video, by breaking down why Davy Jones works so well, and where all of these other characters are going so wrong, and why all of this transcends just the use of CGI and comes down to something a lot more than that. So let's dive into the soggy world of Davy Jones' visual effects, and definitively answer once and for all why he was the pinnacle of photorealism. So I believe a massive reason why Jones looks so realistic comes from the fact that the primary point of focus for this character isn't on epic action scenes or big dramatic speeches, but instead on pure emotionality. Because underneath that soggy wet skin and living tentacle beard, Davy Jones is just a regular guy who's been twisted and tortured by the choices of his past, and all of that is brought to life via both this raw stage presence that he had, but also by the technical workings going on behind the scenes that had to be elevated to such a high level to allow such an emotionally driven performance to be crafted completely out of CGI. Because in using that on-set motion capture technology, his actor, Bill Nighy, had the opportunity to infuse Jones with something genuinely human. Because unlike CG villains in other films, who are primarily present in just action scenes and maybe one or two other dialogue scenes, most of Davy Jones' appearances are instead just pure dialogue. In fact, in Dead Man's Chest, I don't think Jones has a single action scene. And so this means that for an entire film, everything about Jones was centered purely around the character's dialogue, reactions, and interactions, in addition to all of these emotional subtleties going on just underneath the surface of his performance. All of which work to build Jones up into this living, breathing person who can actually respond to the events around him with believable and predictable emotion. But now, obviously, a great performance alone isn't enough for good CGI, because you can have the best actor in the world and it can still look pretty bad. So there's got to be a technical side to this performance as well, something going on under the surface that allowed this digital facial performance to manifest itself as unbeatably realistic. And now you might immediately think, well, that's just because it's motion captured, right? They just recorded Bill Nighy's face and mapped that onto Davy Jones, and that's why it looks so realistic. But this is absolutely not the case. In fact, this is one of the biggest misdirections around VFX and CG characters, and it's been purposefully spread by the film studios. Because in reality, motion capture is never good enough for the final performance that goes up on a big cinema screen. And so, more often than not, this data is only ever really used as a baseline or a reference point, and animators still have to go in and rework this entire performance themselves. And so by only saying, oh yeah, we used motion capture to get the actor's authentic performance, and then omitting the second part where these animators slaved away for hours on the back end, the studios can distance themselves from the negative press CGI gets and come out of this looking like they actually care about art. And so if it's animators and other artists who are the ones refining the performances of all of these motion captured characters, what is the technical factor that gave Jones's performance an edge over the rest of them? Well, I believe this edge came from the fact that, seemingly, the VFX artists have done everything they possibly can to occlude as much of Jones's skin as possible from the audience, as skin is probably the single hardest thing to get looking right with CGI. Because, in real life, it's so flipping complex, with even the tiniest of movements generating a myriad of subtle responses across our skin, like bulging, stretching, wrinkles, colour deformation, etc. And so, to create a realistic CG character, you also have to perfectly recreate all of these details as well, which means the more skin you show, then the more and more of these subtleties you need to account for. Meaning if you take a character who's showing a lot of skin, like Thanos or Azog the Defiler from The Hobbit, then you have to do a lot more work with their skin to keep them looking realistic than you would with Davy Jones. Because yeah, you need to generate all of these skin responses for him too, but only for his face, because they'd hidden his entire body and even the top of his head under multiple layers of much easier to do and a lot less important to an emotional performance CGI clothing. and this meant the artists only had to focus their efforts on this crucial facial area, allowing them much more time to refine it to a high level than if they also had to account for the rest of his body's skin. And so when you combine this high level animation with all of those brilliant subtle facial movements and inclinations in Bill Nighy's performance, and tie all that in with Jones's beautiful tragedy of a backstory, it gives you this genuinely compelling character with a powerful narrative, and it actually makes it quite hard to see Jones as something generated inside of a computer when both his animation and the building blocks of his character are just this strong. But now, there is still more to a good CG character than just their performance. So in mentioning characters like Azog, this does bring me to my next point, which is that Davy Jones is just the perfect example of using CGI where you actually need CGI and then doing something completely different with the opportunities that that CGI presents. Because if you look at Azog or other similar villains, aside from his massive height, did he really need to be CGI? Because they do nothing special with him being CGI. It doesn't unlock any new narrative potential or interesting fight scenes or anything really. And so that just leaves this bitter taste in your mouth because you're sat there looking at this unappealing blob thinking, why? Why did they do this? None of the orcs in the original Lord of the Rings were CGI, and they all looked brilliant. But with Davy Jones, the filmmakers went out of their way to do interesting things with him being CGI. Like having him dramatically play the organ with his beard of tentacles, and all the characterization that comes along with that. Or hiding a key in there as part of the narrative. Or just straight up murdering a guy with them. All of which couldn't have been done without CGI, and yet works to bring in the audience something completely new and very much helps to justify the use of it. But what made this beard truly genius and crucial to Jones's realism is how said beard takes this whole skin hiding technique we mentioned earlier to the next level. As by having it cover only his lower face, they drew a perfect line between having humanoid features and achieving photorealism. Because whilst this beard did still present the VFX artist with its own set of challenges, such as having to write custom programs to calculate the sticky yet autonomous movements of each tentacle, if Jones didn't have this beard and we could instead see his chin and his neck, then not only would the VFX artist have to again account for all the tiny little muscles in there whenever he spoke or breathed, but more importantly, Jones would begin to look closer and closer to your average human. And this means he would begin to edge into the territory known as the uncanny valley, which is a scientific phenomenon where the closer to a human something fake looks, the more likely our brains are to reject it. Because we are so used to looking at human faces and features that once something is sufficiently close enough to looking like a real human, our brains kick in and begin to subconsciously criticize it and pull it apart and just find these tiny little subconscious flaws with it. And so that's why a photorealistic CG human still hasn't really been done yet without the use of deepfakes and stuff. Whereas you have no idea what a living tentacle beard should 100% correctly look like. And so by giving him this fantastical beard, they pulled Jones out of the uncanny valley, stopping our brains from reading him as a fellow human face, which in turn stops that criticism instinct from kicking in, and therefore lets our brains relax around him and more easily accept him as something real. But this was only the tip of the brilliance of this beard. Because what made this even more genius was that by keeping the elements of his face that are crucial to portraying emotion, like the eyes, the mouth, and these somewhat eyebrow things, on full display to the audience, whilst only changing the secondary emotional elements of his face, like his skin texture and of course his entire lower face with the beard, then they struck this perfect balance of a character whose face can tell any story, whilst also having such alien features that our brains just accept it, therefore crafting a balance of an emotional human character and CGI realism that very few other characters have ever managed to find. And now from here, speaking of his skin, this does bring us to another really major factor that contributed to his realism. The genius use of lighting in this film, and how that plays so well with the reflective design of his constantly wet skin. Because around 90% of the time in these films, Davy Jones is shown under one of two types of lighting, either the intense Caribbean sun or the shadowy nighttime, both of which massively complement his visual effects. Because visual effects is a bit like a magic trick. It's an illusion designed to trick your brain, and much like a real magic trick, the less you show your audience, the more they're going to believe in your illusion. And so, dark lighting is obviously ideal for this, because all of this darkness is just going to occlude your CGI naturally. But how does pure daytime brightness hide anything? Well, this plays in masterfully with the reflective nature of his skin, and this is why films like Transformers and the first Iron Man look so good in the bright daytime, because these bright reflections can get so bright that they too technically occlude detail, because the reflective surface just turns into this bright, overexposed, detailless highlight. And when you combine this with the heavy shadows also cast by bright daylight, which plunge areas of the character into darkness, you suddenly have quite a high amount of your character naturally occluded from the audience. And then this reflectivity also goes to the next level with Davy Jones because of a thing VFX artists call subsurface scattering, which in very short is why stuff like, for example, lighter skin has that milky haze to it, because when light penetrates it, it bounces around within it for a while, diffusing itself within like the blood vessels in the skin and stuff, and causing that cloudy look, and then bouncing back out to our eyes again. And so because this is a natural phenomenon, to look real, CGI skin also needs to replicate this too. But all of this light bouncing around within the surface of an object is a flipping lot for a computer to calculate and get looking right, particularly back in 2005, which is actually why a lot of characters had that rubbery plastic look back then, because the computers just weren't able to calculate this under the skin light diffusion correctly. However, if you were to cover that skin with something reflective, say water, then a lot of that light will just get bounced away instead, thus reducing the need for this light diffusion effect, and therefore making it much easier to get a realistic result. And so, as the cursed captain of the seas, Davy Jones could believably have constantly wet skin, and could therefore uniquely take advantage of all of these reflectivity perks in a way that basically no other CGI character can, which further massively enhances his visual quality, especially when in comparison to every other character. And so with all of this, it finally brings me on to those subtle little details that add the icing on the cake to Davy Jones's visual quality. Stuff like how these films were packed with real stunts, explosions and sets and miniatures, all of which accumulate to make a much more real and visceral film experience that could have very easily have gotten lost if these films incorporated too much CGI. Or another big thing that gets overlooked, no pun intended, is the height of Davy Jones relative to his actor. Because nowadays, CG character heights can be whatever you want them to be, which means that on set you have actors crawling around in contraptions to compensate for these new heights and postures, and this has to detract from the realism to some degree. And so when you have Bill Nighy basically standing at Jones's height, it just allows for that further level of authenticity that other films can't really reach. And so overall, I think a lot of these interesting little decisions came from the director himself, Gore Verbinski, having come from a VFX background, as he'd worked in VFX for many years prior to making these films, and so probably had a great sense of the limits of CGI and what to do and not to do with it, and how to tie all of this up with a pretty bow on top and make a great looking CG character. And so, in short, Davy Jones is just the perfect example of stacking the deck in your favour by getting everything right, particularly the lighting, the skin and the clothes. And it's something that modern CGI characters just don't seem to do anymore, making it harder and harder for them to reach that same bar of visual perfection. But you know what? I'm actually perfectly fine with that, because I don't want to see the same thing every time of a CG character covered in clothes at night and made to be soaking wet just to be reflective. I want to see variety, and so it's great that these big budget films are trying to push the envelope each and every time to evolve CGI technology and hopefully bring us new and different stories. However, there is still a lot that modern day projects can learn from Davy Jones, because if your budget is low or your timeline is tight, you really should take these advantages where you can. But what do you guys think? Are there any CG characters that have progressed beyond Davy Jones? And if so, why do you think that these characters worked where so many others have failed? Oh, and also, I just wanted to give a massive shout out and thank you to my first ever Patreon subscriber, Darth Gator. Your support honestly means a lot, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. But yeah, if you like this video and you want to see more deep dives into the best VFX of the last 20 years, then please let me know in the comments below, drop a like and subscribe. Oh, and we also have a Discord channel where we chat about all of this stuff too, so please check the link in the description for that as well. But otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching and have a great day.